Cedar Bend, Wyoming Territory. The 9th of March, 1888. The river was a liar. All through February it had whispered beneath its crust of ice, a faint murmur that promised movement, promised thaw, promised that the world had not forgotten how to flow. But on this morning the Tongue River was silent. Frozen solid from bank to bank and buried under 4 feet of crusted snow, it was as dead as anything Maren Lindquist had ever known. And Martin had known a great deal of death. The letter was not nailed to her door. He was slid beneath it, sometime in the night, like a man too cowardly to knock. She found it when she knelt to blow life into the stove at dawn, her knees cracking against the cold pine floor, her breath a pale ghost in the gray light. The paper was folded once. The handwriting belonged to Aldous Croft, the land agent for the territorial office in Buffalo, a man who dotted his letters with the precision of a schoolmaster and signed his name with a flourish that suggested he believed his signature carried the weight of Scripture. The letter informed her that the grazing lease her husband, Eric, had held on the 40 acres along the river bend was hereby terminated. Eric Lindquist had been dead since January the 14th, killed not by the land but by a horse that stepped into a prairie dog hole at full canter, throwing him head first into a frozen creek bed. The sound his neck made was something the boy who witnessed it, a 14-year-old ranch hand named Pruitt, still could not describe without his hands beginning to shake. The lease, Croft's letter explained, was non-transferable. A woman could not hold a grazing lease. She had until the end of the week to vacate the property and remove her personal effects. 3 days. Aldous Croft rode out that same morning as if the letter alone was insufficient, as if the act required a witness or perhaps a participant. He was not a cruel man. He had brought her a small sack of flour and a tin of coffee, which he set on the table without being asked, the way one leaves flowers at a grave. He was tall and thin, with a beard that grew unevenly and eyes the color of creek water in November, and when he spoke, he looked at a point just above her left shoulder as though addressing a more comfortable version of her that hovered there. "I am sorry about Eric, Mrs. Lindquist," he said. "He was a fair man and a hard worker, but the territorial office has a waiting list for this parcel. Bart Jessup has filed a claim. He has the capital and the cattle. I cannot hold it." "I have cattle," Maren said. Her voice carried the faint clipped vowels of her father's Danish, sounds she had tried to sand away for years, but that surfaced whenever her throat tightened. 11 head, and the cabin is mine. Eric built it. Eric built it on leased land, ma'am. The structure belongs to the territory. Croft shifted his weight. He looked for a moment like a man who wanted to say something else, something that lived in the soft tissue between the law and the truth. But the moment passed. He placed his hat back on his head. The wagon road to Buffalo is still passable. There are boarding houses. I can write you a letter of introduction to Mrs. Adler. She takes in women of circumstance. Women of circumstance. Maren heard the phrase and understood its full architecture. Widows. Women alone. Women who had become inconvenient to the machinery of territory and profit. She said nothing. Croft left. The flowers sat on the table like a small white headstone. The town of Cedar Bend was not much of a town. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a feed-lot, and a scattering of cabins and ranch houses spread along the river like teeth in a broken jaw. It was a place that existed because the river existed, and the river existed because the mountains to the west released their snow each spring in a torrent that carved this valley open like a wound. The people here understood cattle, understood grass, understood the rhythm of seasons as a cycle of labor and recovery. They did not understand Maren. She was an outsider twice over. A widow, yes, which was a kind of social amputation in a place where a woman's standing was measured by the man who vouched for her. But she was also Danish, the daughter of a man named Petter Lindquist, no relation to Eric, a potter from Bornholm who had emigrated to Minnesota when Maren was 9. The coincidence of surnames was what had drawn her and Eric together at a church social in Fargo, a shared name that felt, at the time, like a sign from God. Her father had died of pneumonia 3 years before her marriage, but he had left her something far stranger than money. He had left her his way of seeing. Petter Lindquist had been a potter, a man who spent his life with his hands in earth. He understood clay the way a surgeon understands flesh, not just its surface, but its memory, its behavior under heat and pressure, its capacity to hold warmth long after the fire had gone. He spoke to her constantly as a child, not in the way fathers speak to daughters, with gentle simplifications, but in the way a master speaks to an apprentice, with the assumption that she would need this knowledge someday. "The surface is a fool, Marin," he would say, his hand shaping a ball on the wheel, the wet clay spinning between his palms like a living thing. "It tells you what the weather is now, but the earth beneath your feet remembers what the weather was yesterday, last week, last season. A good potter listens to the clay. A wise woman listens to the ground." She remembered these words now, standing at the edge of her soon-to-be former home, looking out at the dead river, the white and silent world, the sky that pressed down like the lid of a kiln. The townspeople had offered her pity. Martha Pruitt, the mother of the boy who had watched Eric die, brought a pot of elk stew and stood in the doorway as if afraid that widowhood was contagious. Old Hagen at the store let her buy on credit and then told her almost apologetically that the credit would end when the lease did. They meant well, but their sympathy had the half-life of a matchstick in the wind. Pity was quickly chased away by self-preservation. Everyone was rationing. The winter of 1887 into 1888 had been a punishment from a god who had apparently grown tired of the cattle barons and the homesteaders and the entire optimistic machinery of westward expansion. Cattle were dying in the draws. Hay was worth more than silver. The river, which should have begun to show the first fractures of thaw by early March, remained locked and silent, a corpse in a white coffin. Marn did not argue. She did not plead. She began to walk, not toward Buffalo, not toward the wagon road or Mrs. Adler's boarding house or any destination that Aldous Croft's letter of introduction might unlock. She walked south, along the frozen river, pulling a travois she had built from 2 lodgepole pine saplings and a strip of elk hide. On it she had loaded her bedroll, a crate of her father's pottery tools, Eric's skinning knife, a sack of dried beans, a pouch of salt, and a small leather-bound journal that had belonged to her father. The journal was written half in Danish and half in a private shorthand that Peter had invented, a language of diagrams and arrows and numbers that mapped the thermal properties of different clays, different stones, different configurations of earth and fire. It was the most valuable thing she owned, and no one in Cedar Bend would have given a nickel for it. She walked for 2 hours. The cold was not the dramatic, howling cold of a blizzard. It was the quiet cold, the kind that killed without theater, that crept into the joints in the jaw and the spaces between the ribs, patient and thorough. Her destination was a place she had found in October, when the world was still gold and the river was still alive. She had been gathering willow shoots for basket weaving when she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. The riverbank, at a particular bend where the current had carved a deep undercut into a bluff of red clay, was warm. Not metaphorically warm, not warm in the way that a sheltered spot feels warm out of the wind. Physically, measurably warm. She had pressed her palm against the exposed clay face and felt heat radiating from it, gentle and steady, like the wall of a kiln hours after the fire has died. Steam rose from a crack in the rock above, a thin, almost invisible thread of moisture that vanished into the October air. She had knelt and pressed her ear to the clay, and she heard it, a sound like breathing. Water moving somewhere beneath the surface, hot water, pushed up from whatever forge burned in the belly of the earth. Her father would have known instantly what it was. The old country had its own thermal springs, its own places where the earth exhaled. He had told her about the Roman hypocausts, the ancient heating systems that channeled hot water beneath stone floors. The Romans did not invent warmth, he had said. They simply asked the earth to share. Now, in March, with her life loaded on a travois and the town of Cedar Bend shrinking behind her, Marin returned to the warm bend. The undercut in the bluff was deeper than she remembered, nearly 8 feet at its tallest point, carved by centuries of spring floods into a shallow cave with a floor of packed red clay. The exposed rock face at the back still radiated that impossible warmth. When she pressed her bare hand against it, the heat was stronger now than in October, as if the earth, denied its usual release to the frozen river, had concentrated its energy here. The clay was the temperature of a human body. The air inside the undercut smelled of mineral water and iron and something faintly sulfurous, the breath of deep geology. She began to work. The first day she used Eric's knife and a flat stone to carve a shelf into the clay wall for her supplies. She cleared the floor of river cobbles and debris, stacking the stones in a low wall across the mouth of the undercut to block the wind. The gap she left was narrow, barely wide enough to pass through sideways, oriented away from the prevailing northwest wind. By nightfall, she had a space roughly 7 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet tall at its peak. The back wall was warm. The floor was cool but not frozen. The air was still. She did not build a fire that first night. She did not need to. She spread her bedroll on a thick layer of dried grass she had gathered from the south-facing slope above the bluff, and she lay down against the warm clay wall. The sensation was extraordinary. It was like pressing against the flank of a sleeping animal, a vast, slow, ancient animal whose heartbeat was measured in geological time. She slept deeply for the first time since Eric's death. Over the following 2 weeks, Maren transformed the undercut into something that had no name in English, something between a home and a kiln and a living system. She worked from her father's journal, translating his diagrams into action. The key principle she understood was thermal mass. The clay bluff itself was an enormous battery of heat, charged by the geothermal water flowing somewhere beneath it. But that heat needed to be captured, directed, and held. Left open to the air, it would dissipate. Enclosed properly, it would accumulate. She began by sealing the walls. Using the red clay from the riverbank, mixed with dried grass and ash, she plastered the interior of the undercut in thick, smooth layers, the way her father had lined his kilns. The clay was magnificent, dense and plastic, and full of iron oxide, the kind of clay Peter would have wept to work with. Each layer she applied was an inch thick. She let each layer dry partially before applying the next, building up a thermal lining 4 inches deep. The clay absorbed the heat from the rock behind it and radiated it inward, evenly, steadily, like the walls of a bread oven hours after baking. She improved the entrance. Using flat river stones and more clay, she built a proper doorway, low and narrow, with a heavy elkite hung over it as a curtain. She angled the entrance passage so that it turned twice before reaching the main chamber, a design her father had sketched in his journal and labeled with the Danish word for breath trap. The turns prevented wind from driving directly into the living space and created a pocket of dead air that acted as insulation. She discovered, almost by accident, that the thermal spring was closer to the surface than she had guessed. While digging a shallow trench along the base of the back wall to improve drainage, her shovel broke through into a layer of gravel, through which hot water seeped. Not a gush, but a steady, warm trickle, perhaps a gallon an hour, that collected in the trench and ran toward the river. She lined the trench with clay, creating a channel, and suddenly she had something astonishing. A continuous flow of warm water running through the floor of her shelter, heating the stones and clay above it before draining away. Her father had drawn this exact system in his journal, annotated with a note that read, in his careful hand, "The floor must drink before the room can breathe." The warmth inside this shelter became remarkable. On days when the outside temperature plunged to 20 below zero, the interior held steady at a temperature Maren estimated was near 50 degrees. She could remove her coat. She could work with bare hands. The clay walls, fully dried and cured by the constant gentle heat, glowed with a warm, reddish color and felt like sun-warmed stone under her palms. She even wrote to the river. This was the part that would have confirmed, to anyone watching, that the Danish widow had lost her mind entirely. Each morning, she walked to the edge of the frozen Tongue River with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper, and she wrote a few lines. Then, she folded the paper and tucked it into a crack in the ice. She wrote about the water temperature in her trench. She wrote about the birds she saw. She wrote about the angle of the sun. She was not writing to the river. She was writing to Eric, whose body had been found in a frozen creek, who had loved this river, who had told her once that rivers do not die, they simply go underground and wait. The letters accumulated in the ice like small white prayers. Cedar Bend heard about the Widows Project in pieces, the way frontier towns receive all information through the distorted lens of gossip and incredulity. A hunter named Farley had seen her from a ridge, working on the bluff, smearing mud on rocks like a woman possessed. He told Hagen at the store. Hagen told Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and sat on the territorial advisory board, and who had personally recommended Bar Jessup for Marin's old lease, listened to the account with the expression of a man being told that a chicken had learned to read. "She is living in a mud hole by the river?" Silas said, not as a question. "Writing letters to the water. That's what Farley says." Silas shook his head. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with hands that had doped fences and broken horses and signed documents that determined other people's futures. He was not unkind. He had sent his foreman to check on the Jessup family twice during the worst of the cold, and he had donated a cord of wood to the widow Patterson when her supply ran low. But he operated within a framework of knowledge that had no room for what Marin was doing. In his world, you survived winter by building thick walls, burning hot fires, and having enough provisions to outlast the siege. What Marin was doing was not survival. It was theater. It was the derangement of grief. Someone should bring her in before she freezes, he said. But he did not go himself, and no one else volunteered. And the matter was set aside, filed under the category of things that would resolve themselves one way or another. The blizzard arrived on the 23rd of March. It came not from the northwest, as storms usually did, but from the north, straight down from Montana, a wall of white fury that dropped temperatures to 35 below zero in 6 hours. The wind was not wind, it was a solid thing, a moving wall of ice crystals that stripped the heat from any surface it touched. Cattle died standing up. The snow fell so thick and so fast that men could not see their own hands. Cedar Bend, which had already endured a winter of biblical cruelty, now faced its final and most savage chapter. Silas Blackwood's ranch house, the finest structure in the valley, built of squared logs 18 inches thick, with a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, became a refrigerator within the first night. The wind found every chink, every gap, every place where the logs had shrunk from the joists. The fireplace roared, consuming wood at an alarming rate, and the heat it produced was stolen almost instantly by the draft that poured through the walls. His family huddled in the kitchen, the smallest room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The temperature inside the house dropped to freezing. His youngest daughter, a girl of 6 named Clara, developed a cough that deepened with each passing hour. Across the valley, the story was the same. The Jessup family in Marin's old cabin found that the chimney had cracked in the cold and was drawing smoke back into the room. They sealed it and nearly suffocated. Old Hagen closed the store and retreated to his back room, burning furniture to stay warm. The Pruitt family lost 2 horses and a milk cow in the first night. Martha Pruitt, who had brought Marin elk stew, now stood over a stove that could not heat a room 10 feet square and thought with a guilt that tasted like copper in her mouth of the woman she had not helped enough. The blizzard lasted 5 days. On the second day, Silas Blackwood did something he had never done. He prayed, not the formal, upright prayer of a Sunday service, but the desperate bargaining prayer of a man who can feel the cold killing his child by degrees. Clara's cough had become a wet, rattling thing that shook her small body. He held her against his chest and felt the terrible mathematics of heat loss, her small body radiating warmth into air that stole it as fast as it was produced. On the 6th morning, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a blue so bright and so cold it looked like the inside of a diamond. The silence was immense. Cedar Bend emerged from its houses like survivors of a shipwreck. They were haggard, frostbitten, diminished. 3 people had died. Old Hagen's neighbor, a bachelor named Wiley, was found frozen in his bed. The Jessup infant had not survived the night the chimney cracked. And a ranch hand on the Patterson spread had walked into the storm on the 3rd night and never returned. Silas Blackwood, his daughter wrapped in blankets in the back of his wagon, drove south along the river. He did not know exactly what he expected to find. A body, perhaps. A frozen mud hole? Confirmation that the conventional wisdom was correct, and that the widow's madness had come to its inevitable end. What he found instead was smoke. A thin, clean wisp of it rising from the bluff above the river bend, so calm and vertical in the still morning air that it looked painted there. He stopped the wagon. He stared. Then he climbed down and walked toward the bluff, his boots punching through the crusted snow, his breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Marn was outside. She was kneeling by the frozen river, tucking a folded piece of paper into a crack in the ice. One of her letters. She was wearing no coat, just a wool sweater and a canvas apron, her sleeves pushed up past her elbows. Her forearms were bare and pink, not with cold, but with warmth. She looked up at him. Her face was calm. Her eyes, pale blue, carried no hostility and no triumph. She looked like a woman who had slept well and eaten breakfast and stepped outside to check on the morning. Silas Blackwood stood there in his 4 layers of wool, his face raw, his daughter coughing in the wagon behind him. He looked at the bare arms. He looked at the smoke. He looked at the small white papers in the ice, the letters to a dead river that was not, as it turned out, dead at all. Something cracked in him, not his pride exactly. Something deeper, the certainty that had carried him through 47 years of building and breaking and deciding. He looked at the dark entrance in the bluff and felt warmth drifting from it, a breath of air that smelled of warm clay and mineral water, and his hands began to shake. "My girl is sick," he said. His voice was stripped of everything. Authority, certainty, judgment. It was the voice of a father, the cold. Her lungs. Maren stood. She looked past him to the wagon, to the small shape bundled in blankets. She walked toward it without a word. She lifted the canvas and looked at Clara, listened to her breathing, placed the back of her hand against the child's forehead. Then she turned to Silas. "Bring her inside." The interior of the shelter stopped Silas in his doorway. He had expected a mud cave. He found a room. The walls glowed amber in the light of a single tallow candle. The air was warm, not cold, but genuinely warm and humid, with a moisture that smelled of clean earth and hot stone. The floor was smooth, slightly warm underfoot. A thin channel of water ran along the base of the back wall, steaming faintly before disappearing into a clay-lined drain. Dried herbs hung from wooden pegs driven into the walls. A small shelf held jars of rendered fat, dried meat, and what appeared to be a sourdough starter, alive and bubbling gently. Clara was placed on a thick pallet of elk hide and dried grass near the warmest wall. Within an hour, her breathing eased. The wet rattle softened. Color returned to her cheeks. She slept. Silas sat on a stone ledge near the entrance, his coat removed for the first time in 5 days, and watched his daughter sleep in a mud shelter built by a woman he had allowed to be cast out. He said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I sent Farley to check on you. 2 weeks ago. He told me you were mad." He paused. He looked at his hands, calloused and cracked and suddenly useless. "I believed him because it was easier than coming myself." Marin poured hot water from a clay vessel into a tin cup and handed it to him. Wild mint and dried yarrow. The steam rose between them. "Your walls are warm," he said, as if stating this fact might help him understand it. "The earth is warm," Marin said. "I did not make the warmth. I just gave it a place to gather." She pointed to the channel of water along the floor. "This is a thermal spring. The water comes from deep below, where the rock is always hot. It heats the clay holds the heat and gives it back to the air, slowly, the way a stone holds the sun after dark. My father was a potter. He understood this. A kiln is not a fire. A kiln is a memory of fire." Silas looked at the wall. He placed his bare hand against it. Warm, unbelievably, impossibly warm. The same clay that lay frozen and dead on every riverbank in the territory was here a living source of heat. His eyes moved to the small leather journal open on the shelf, its pages covered in diagrams and notations in a language he could not read. "Show me," he said. "Bring more people first," Marin replied. "The Jessops lost their baby. The Pruitts need help. Bring them here, and I will show everyone at once." He looked at her. She was not bargaining. She was not leveraging. She was counting. By the following afternoon, 11 people were gathered in and around Marin's shelter. Martha Pruitt wept when she entered and felt the warmth, not from relief, but from the accumulated weight of every small kindness she had failed to extend. Bart Jessup, the man who had taken Marin's lease, stood at the entrance with his hat in his hands and could not bring himself to cross the threshold until Marin handed him a cup of mint tea and said, simply, "Come in. There is room." She taught them, not in a single lesson, but over the weeks that followed, as March turned grudgingly toward April. She showed them how to identify thermal seeps by the pattern of snowmelt along creek banks. She showed them how to mix clay and grass into a plaster that could line any existing wall, tripling its capacity to hold heat. She taught them the principle of the breath trap, the angled entrance that prevented wind from stealing warmth. She explained thermal mass the way her father had explained it to her, with her hands in the clay, with analogies drawn from baking and pottery, and the way a river stone stays warm in your pocket long after you leave the fire. Aldous Croft rode out in April to inspect the Jessup claim. He found Bart Jessup and Marin Linguist working side by side, plastering the north wall of the cabin with a thick layer of clay and sod. Croft watched for a while. Then he dismounted, took off his coat, and said something that surprised even himself. "Mrs. Linguist, the territorial office has a parcel at the river bend. Unclaimed, unsuitable for grazing. The bluff land. If you were to file on it, I do not believe there would be any competing interests." Marin looked at him. She looked at the bluff in the distance, at the thin wisp of steam still rising from the clay face. She nodded. When the spring thaw finally came, in late April, the Tongue River woke. The ice cracked and shifted and broke apart in great groaning sheets, and the water beneath surged back to life, brown and fast and full of snowmelt. As the ice broke up, small white squares of paper tumbled and spun in the current. Marin's letters, released from their frozen archive, carried downstream toward the Yellowstone, toward the Missouri, toward the sea. Some of them washed up on gravel bars. A few were found by rangers miles downstream, waterlogged and illegible. But the river carried one letter onto the bank at the base of Marin's bluff, as if returning it. She found it caught in the roots of a willow, the paper soft and translucent, the pencil marks barely visible. She could make out 2 words in her own handwriting. Still warm, she folded it and placed it inside her father's journal between 2 pages of kiln diagrams and closed the cover. The shelter at the river bend stood for 40 years. Travelers passing through the valley would remark on the strange clay structure built into the bluff, and on the woman who lived there, and on the peculiar fact that in the coldest winters, when every other chimney in Cedar Bend poured smoke, her home seemed to breathe on its own. So here is the question that the story of Marin Linguist leaves with you, the one listening right now. What river have you stopped writing to? What thing in your life have you declared dead, frozen, finished, simply because the surface shows no movement? Because the surface is a fool. The surface will lie to you every time. Underneath the frozen crust, the water is still moving. The heat is still rising. The current is still there waiting for you to trust it. What knowledge did someone leave you that you have folded up and filed away because the world around you called it useless? Whose journal is sitting in your attic? Whose voice do you hear in the back of your mind, telling you something that makes no sense to anyone else, but makes perfect sense to you? The people around you will call it madness. They will say you are writing letters to a dead river. They will say you are smearing mud on rocks. They will say, with the absolute confidence of experts, that you are digging your own grave. Let them, because somewhere beneath the surface the earth is warm. Somewhere in the knowledge you have been taught to disregard, there is a principle that can change everything. And somewhere, in a crack in the ice, a letter is waiting to be delivered. Your river is not dead. Your clay is waiting. Start writing. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to geothermal energy and thermal mass construction. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.